Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Imagine being guilt-tripped into paying off your father's gambling debts, only to watch your sister live it up with designer bags and luxury vacations. That's the situation I found myself in, and trust me, the family drama only got messier from there. I had just kicked off my shoes and sunk into the couch after a long day at work when my phone rang. Seeing my mom's name flash on the screen, I hesitated. Calls from her at odd hours usually meant one of two things: family drama or a request for help. Against my better judgment, I picked up. "Hey, Mom," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "We need to talk," she replied immediately, her voice heavy. No pleasantries, no small talk, just straight to business. That was never a good sign. "What's going on?" I asked, already bracing for whatever bombshell she was about to drop. There was a long pause, the kind that made my stomach twist into knots. Finally, she said it. "It's about your father. His gambling, it's gotten worse. He owes a lot of money, and we need your help to pay it off." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. "Wait, you're asking me to pay off Dad's gambling debts?" I said, sitting up straighter on the couch. "Yes," she said, as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. "You're doing well for yourself, and we don't have many options left. This is serious, honey. He could lose everything." I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. "Mom, I've worked hard to get where I am. Why should I be responsible for his choices?" Her tone shifted, becoming sharper. "Because he's your father," she said, as though that single fact explained everything. "Family helps each other in times of need. Or are you too selfish to care?" Selfish. The word hung in the air, and I felt my jaw tighten. "Mom," I began, trying to keep my frustration in check. "I understand that this is a serious situation, but Dad's gambling isn't new. This has been an issue for years, and nothing ever changes. Throwing money at the problem isn't going to fix it." She let out a frustrated sigh. "That's easy for you to say when you're not the one living with the stress. Do you think I enjoy dealing with this? Do you think I like asking you for help? We're desperate, and you're in a position to make a difference." Her words stung, but they didn't sway me. "What about Julia?" I asked, desperate to redirect the conversation. "Why not ask her for help? She's got money to spare." "She's not in a place to help right now," my mom said quickly, dismissively. "Besides, we know we can count on you." I scoffed. "So, Julia gets a free pass to live her lavish lifestyle, while I'm expected to clean up Dad's mess. How is that fair?" "It's not about fairness," she snapped. "It's about doing what needs to be done." I could feel my blood boiling, but I took a deep breath, determined to stay calm. "I'm sorry, Mom, but I can't do this. I've worked too hard to get out of debt and build a stable life for myself. I'm not going to jeopardize that because Dad refuses to take responsibility for his actions." Her tone turned icy. "I can't believe you're being so selfish," she said. "This isn't just about your father. It's about keeping this family together. If we lose the house, it's on you." Her words cut deeper than I wanted to admit, but I refused to back down. "If you lose the house, it's because Dad's gambling put you in this position. Not me," I said firmly. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this, but I can't be the solution to a problem I didn't create." The conversation ended with her hanging up abruptly, leaving me sitting there with a mix of anger and guilt swirling in my chest. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the weight of the call. My mom's words replayed in my head, each one sharper than the last. "Selfish. Family. It's on you." I knew I'd made the right decision, but that didn't make it any easier. Growing up, I'd always been the responsible one, the one who could be counted on when things got tough. But now, I couldn't help but wonder if that role had turned into a trap, one I wasn't sure I could escape. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, one thought kept running through my mind. This was only the beginning. For the next few days, my mom's words played on a loop in my mind. "Or are you too selfish to care?" The accusation stung more than I wanted to admit. She had a way of cutting straight to the part of me that always wanted to do right by the family, even when it wasn't deserved. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I'd spent years building my career, budgeting carefully, and pulling myself out of debt, all while watching my dad dig himself deeper into his gambling habit. And now, just because I was in a good place financially, I was expected to swoop in and clean up his mess. It didn't sit right with me. When my mom called again, I almost didn't pick up, but avoiding her wouldn't solve anything, and I figured it was better to rip the bandage off. "Hi, Mom," I said cautiously as I answered the call. "Hi, sweetheart," she replied, her tone overly sweet, the way it always was when she was trying to manipulate me. I just wanted to check in and see if you'd thought about what we talked about. I sighed, already bracing for the guilt trip I knew was coming. Mom, I've thought about it, and I still don't think it's fair to ask me to pay off Dad's debts. He needs to take responsibility for his own actions. Her tone shifted immediately, becoming sharper. You think I haven't tried to get him to change? She snapped. Do you know how hard it's been for me to keep this family together? I've been holding everything together on my own, and now I'm asking for a little help from you. And you can't even do that. It's not about that, I said, trying to stay calm. I've worked hard to get where I am, and I'm not willing to jeopardize my financial stability for a problem I didn't create. Her response was exactly what I'd expected. So you are too selfish to care, she said, her voice dripping with disappointment. That word, selfish, hung in the air like a heavy cloud. It was the same word she'd used when I decided not to go to college close to home, when I chose a career she didn't understand, and when I refused to co-sign a loan for her years ago. I'm not selfish, Mom, I said firmly. I'm realistic. Bailing Dad out isn't going to solve anything. It's just going to give him permission to keep doing what he's been doing. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. He's your father. He's not perfect, but he's still family. And family helps each other, especially in times of need. Helping him wouldn't be helping, I said. It would be enabling. If you really want to fix this, you need to get him professional help. Not throw money at the problem and hope it goes away. She let out a bitter laugh. It's easy for you to say that when you're not the one dealing with the fallout. I get that this is hard for you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But it's hard for me too. I've worked so hard to get where I am, and it feels like you're asking me to sacrifice that for someone who hasn't learned from his mistakes. The conversation ended with her sighing and saying, I just hope you can live with yourself. It was the kind of comment designed to dig under my skin, and it worked. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was letting her down, even though I knew deep down that I was making the right decision. The next day, she sent me a long text, laying on the guilt even thicker. I'm disappointed in you, she wrote. I thought I raised you to value family above all else. I guess I was wrong. I hope you never find yourself in a position where you need help and no one is willing to give it to you. I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether to respond. In the end, I decided not to. Nothing I said would change her mind, and I wasn't going to waste my energy defending myself when I knew I wasn't in the wrong. Over the next few days, the calls and texts from her became more frequent. Each one was a variation of the same theme: family, duty, and my supposed selfishness. Meanwhile, my dad stayed conspicuously silent. It was as if this wasn't even his problem to deal with. It was just something for my mom to fix, with me as her backup plan. The more I thought about it, the more resolved I became. I wasn't going to let her guilt me into making a decision I knew wasn't right. I wasn't responsible for my dad's choices, and I wasn't going to be their financial safety net. Still, the weight of her words lingered. No matter how justified I felt, it was hard to shake the feeling that I was letting someone down. And that's what made this situation so infuriating. The constant tug-of-war between doing what was best for me and living up to the impossible expectations they'd placed on me my whole life. For now, all I could do was stand my ground and hope that eventually they'd see reason. If the guilt trips from my mom weren't frustrating enough, what truly pushed me over the edge was my sister, Julia. While I was being hounded to rescue my dad from his self-inflicted financial disaster, Julia was off living a life straight out of a luxury magazine. Her social media was a constant stream of designer shopping hauls, exotic beach vacations, and expensive dinners at restaurants where the appetizers probably cost more than my weekly groceries. It was infuriating to see her flaunt a lifestyle so disconnected from the chaos our family was facing, while I was expected to clean up the mess. During one particularly heated conversation with my mom, I decided to bring it up. Why aren't you asking Julia to help? I said, struggling to keep the frustration out of my voice. She's clearly got money to spare. My mom let out an exasperated sigh, as if the question itself was absurd. Julia's going through a lot right now, she said, her tone dripping with sympathy. She's under a lot of pressure with her career, and I don't want to burden her with this. I blinked, stunned. A lot of pressure? Are you kidding me? She's literally posting pictures of herself lounging by a pool in Bali. How is that pressure? She has her own struggles, my mom said defensively. Just because it looks glamorous doesn't mean her life is easy. Besides, you're the more responsible one. We know we can count on you. That was the line that always got me. You're the responsible one. For as long as I could remember, that label had been both a badge of honor and a chain around my neck. Being responsible meant I was expected to pick up the slack when others fell short, to be the reliable one no matter the cost to myself. Being responsible doesn't mean I'm a doormat, I said, my voice rising. Julia gets to live her best life, and I'm the one who has to sacrifice everything? How is that fair? Life isn't always fair, my mom shot back, her tone sharper now. But that doesn't mean you just give up on your family. We're asking for your help because we trust you to do the right thing. Maybe you should trust Julia to step up for once, I snapped. She's had just as much support from you and Dad. Probably more. And yet somehow, I'm the one who always has to clean up the messes. Don't make this about Julia, she said quickly, trying to redirect the conversation. This is about your father. He's in trouble, and we need to come together as a family to help him. I knew she was trying to appeal to my sense of loyalty, but the logic didn't hold up. My dad's gambling problem wasn't new. It was a recurring issue that had been swept under the rug for years. And Julia's lifestyle wasn't just a coincidence. It was a direct result of the same favoritism that had always left me feeling like an afterthought. Later that evening, I scrolled through Julia's Instagram, my frustration building with each post. There she was in a sparkling gown at some fancy gala, holding a glass of champagne with a caption that read, "Work hard, play harder." The next post was a picture of a designer handbag with the caption, "How to treat myself." Treat herself? Meanwhile, I was being told that it was my duty to drain my savings to cover debts that weren't mine. I decided I needed to talk to Julia directly. If she wasn't going to step up on her own, maybe I could convince her to take some responsibility. The next day I called her and asked if we could meet for coffee. She sounded cheerful and oblivious, agreeing without hesitation. When we sat down, I wasted no time. Mom and Dad told me about Dad's gambling debts, I said. They're asking me to help pay them off. Julia's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. Oh wow, that's a lot, she said, sipping her latte. Yeah, it is, I said, leaning forward, which is why I think you should help. You're in a better financial position than I am, and honestly, it's only fair that we split the responsibility. Julia tilted her head, her expression turning defensive. Why should I get involved, she said. I didn't create this mess. Dad's gambling is his problem, not mine. Are you serious right now? I asked, incredulous. You've benefited from their support just as much as I have, probably more. And now you're saying it's not your problem? She shrugged. Look, I have my own expenses to worry about. If Mom and Dad want to enable Dad's behavior, that's on them. I'm not throwing my money away on something that's never going to change. Her indifference left me speechless. On one hand, I couldn't completely disagree with her logic. My dad's gambling was a black hole, and throwing money at it wouldn't fix the root of the problem. But the way she so casually washed her hands of the situation, leaving me to deal with it alone, made my blood boil. So, you get to buy designer handbags and go on luxury vacations while I'm supposed to clean up the mess? I said, my voice shaking with anger. Julia rolled her eyes. Don't make this about me, she said. If you want to help them, that's your choice. But don't try to guilt me into doing the same. I left the cafe feeling more frustrated than ever. Julia wasn't going to help, and my mom clearly wasn't going to pressure her. Once again, I was the responsible one, left to deal with a problem no one else wanted to acknowledge. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, one thought kept running through my mind. How much longer could I keep being the one they relied on? And at what cost to myself? The tension had been brewing for days. My mom's relentless guilt trips and Julia's glaring absence from the family drama had left me on edge. Every time I thought about the situation, frustration bubbled up inside me like a volcano ready to erupt. It wasn't just the unfairness of it all. It was the fact that Julia seemed to skate through life completely untouched by the consequences of her choices. I decided I couldn't let it fester any longer. If Julia wasn't going to step up on her own, then I needed to confront her directly. Maybe hearing it face to face would make her realize how ridiculous her position was. I called her that afternoon and asked if we could meet. She sounded cheerful, as usual, agreeing without hesitation. I met her at her favorite cafe, the kind of trendy spot where lattes came with foam art and every pastry cost more than a full breakfast elsewhere. When I arrived, she was already there, scrolling through her phone and sipping an iced coffee that probably cost $15. Hey, she said brightly, waving me over. Hey, I said, forcing a tight smile as I sat across from her. Thanks for meeting me. Of course, she said, putting her phone down. What's up? I cut straight to the point. Mom and Dad told me about Dad's gambling debts, I said, and how they want me to help pay them off. Her cheerful expression didn't waver. Oh yeah, Mom mentioned something about that, she said casually, taking another sip of her coffee. Well, they didn't just mention it to me, I said, leaning forward. They've been pressuring me nonstop to step in and cover the debt. And for some reason, you're not part of that conversation. Julia raised an eyebrow. Why would I be? Her nonchalance hit me like a slap in the face. Why wouldn't you be? I shot back. You've benefited just as much, if not more, from their support over the years. And yet somehow, I'm the one who's expected to clean up Dad's mess. How does that make sense? She shrugged, unbothered. Look, I get that it sucks, but that's not my problem. If they want to enable Dad's behavior, that's on them. I'm not getting involved. Her indifference was infuriating. So, you get to spend thousands on handbags and vacations while I'm supposed to drain my savings to bail out Dad? I said, my voice rising despite myself. I don't see how my lifestyle has anything to do with this, she said, crossing her arms. I work hard for my money. If you want to give yours away, that's your choice. Do you even hear yourself? I asked, my hands gripping the edge of the table. You've spent your whole life taking advantage of their generosity. College tuition? Paid. Wedding? Covered. And now you're acting like you're above all this? Like it's somehow not your responsibility because you're too busy treating yourself? Julia rolled her eyes. You're being dramatic. Just because they help me doesn't mean I owe them my financial stability. And honestly, if you feel that way, maybe you shouldn't help them either. That's not the point. I snapped. The point is that they've been bending over backward for you while I've had to fight for everything I have. And now, when it's time to step up, you're nowhere to be found. Maybe that's because I know when to draw the line, she said coldly. I'm not going to let their problems ruin my life. If you want to be the martyr, go ahead. But don't expect me to join you. Her words stung, not because they were entirely wrong, but because they were so callous. Julia had always been good at looking out for herself, but this was a new low. I stood up, unable to sit there any longer. You know what? You're right, I said, my voice steady but icy. I'm not going to ruin my life for their problems. But don't think for a second that you're off the hook. They've made sacrifices for you, too, whether you want to admit it or not. Thanks for the lecture, she said dryly, picking up her phone. Let me know how it works out for you. As I walked out of the cafe, I felt a mixture of anger and clarity. Julia wasn't going to help. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't care. And as much as it hurt, I realized I couldn't force her to step up. The responsibility she refused to take wasn't mine to carry. If my parents wanted to enable her lifestyle and ignore the consequences, that was their choice. But I wasn't going to let myself be dragged down with them. For the first time, I felt a sliver of peace. I couldn't control what Julia or my parents did, but I could control my own decisions. And that was enough. The aftermath of my confrontation with Julia left a rift in the family that seemed to grow wider with every passing day. My mom's frustration over my refusal to pay off my dad's gambling debts turned into an endless cycle of calls and messages. Every interaction with her was a minefield, filled with alternating pleas, guilt trips, and outright anger. You don't understand how much stress this is putting on me, she said during one particularly heated call. Your father's not perfect, but he's still your dad. And if you really cared about this family, you'd step up and help. Mom, I do care, I said, my voice tight with frustration. But caring doesn't mean throwing my financial future down the drain. You're asking me to sacrifice everything I've worked for because Dad refuses to change. Her response was sharper than I expected. If we lose the house because of this, it's on you, she snapped. And I hope you can live with that. Julia, meanwhile, remained as uninvolved as ever. She continued to act like the entire situation didn't exist, deflecting any attempts to discuss it. When I tried to bring it up again, she rolled her eyes and said, We've already been over this. I'm not getting dragged into their mess. Her indifference only made my mom's accusations sting more. Whenever Julia's name came up, my mom would brush it off with excuses. Julia has a lot on her plate, she'd say. Or, she's just not in a position to help right now. I couldn't hold back my anger during one of our calls. Mom, Julia's not helping because you're not asking her to, I said. You're letting her off the hook while putting everything on me. How is that fair? It's not about fairness, she replied sharply. It's about who can actually make a difference. And that's you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. They confirmed what I'd always suspected but tried to ignore. My parents didn't expect Julia to step up because they'd never held her accountable for anything. The tension came to a head one evening when my mom showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door to find her standing there, her expression a mix of frustration and desperation. We need to talk, she said, walking past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation. I crossed my arms, bracing myself. I've already told you where I stand, Mom. And I've told you this isn't just about you, she shot back, spinning to face me. This family is falling apart. and you're sitting here acting like it's not your problem. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. No, Mom. This family is falling apart because Dad's gambling has gone unchecked for years. And because you've been enabling him instead of holding him accountable. Her face flushed with anger. Do you have any idea how hard it's been for me? She said, her voice trembling. I've spent years cleaning up after your father, trying to hold everything together. And now, when I need your help, you're abandoning me. Abandoning you? I repeated, incredulous. I'm not the one who put us in this position. And I'm not the one who's refusing to take responsibility. Dad is. If you want to keep enabling him, that's your choice. But don't expect me to do the same. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, I thought she might actually hear what I was saying. But then she straightened up, her expression hardening again. You're being selfish, she said quietly. One day, when you have a family of your own, you'll understand what it means to make sacrifices for the people you love. I stared at her, feeling a mix of sadness and anger. I do understand sacrifice, I said. I've been sacrificing for this family my entire life. But this isn't a sacrifice. It's enabling a toxic cycle. And I won't do it. Her face fell, and she turned to leave without another word. As the door closed behind her, I felt a strange combination of relief and guilt. I'd stood my ground, but the cost of doing so was becoming clearer by the day. The days that followed were quiet, but not in a comforting way. My mom stopped calling as often, and when she did, the conversations were cold and distant. Julia, of course, stayed completely out of it, going about her life as though nothing had changed. I knew I'd made the right decision, but the growing divide in the family weighed on me. For years, I'd been the one trying to keep us together. But now I couldn't help but wonder if walking away from this fight would mean losing them altogether. The thought was painful, but I reminded myself that I wasn't the one tearing the family apart. My dad's actions and my mom's refusal to hold him accountable had brought us here, not me. Still, the realization didn't make it any easier. And deep down, I knew this fight wasn't over yet. The tension in my family had reached a boiling point, and I found myself consumed by the nagging question. How did we even get here? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than what my mom had been willing to share. My dad's gambling habits didn't just spring out of nowhere, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew about the full extent of his problem. That's when I decided to dig deeper. I wasn't looking for an excuse to change my mind. I knew I wasn't going to pay off his debts, but I needed clarity. I reached out to a mutual acquaintance who I knew had some insight into my dad's gambling history. What they told me left me reeling. Apparently, this wasn't my dad's first run-in with massive debts. Twice before, he'd gotten himself into trouble with gambling, and both times, my mom had quietly bailed him out. She'd covered his losses and swept the entire situation under the rug, never telling me or Julia a word about it. The information hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd always suspected my mom was enabling him in some way, but hearing it confirmed made my blood boil. She'd spent years hiding the truth, allowing him to spiral deeper into his addiction while protecting us, or so she thought, from the consequences. That evening, I went over to her house, still fuming from what I'd learned. She greeted me at the door with her usual strained smile, but the moment we sat down, I cut straight to the point. I know about Dad's previous debts, I said, watching her face closely for a reaction. Her eyes widened for a split second before she quickly composed herself. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb, Mom, I said, my voice sharp. I talked to someone who knows about Dad's gambling history. This isn't the first time he's racked up debts, and it's not the first time you've bailed him out. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to worry you, she said, her voice defensive. It wasn't as bad as this time, and I thought we could handle it. I stared at her in disbelief. You thought you could handle it? Mom, do you even realize how much damage you've done by covering for him? He's never had to face the consequences of his actions because you've always been there to clean up the mess. It's not that simple, she said, her voice trembling. I was trying to keep this family together. If I hadn't stepped in, we could have lost everything. And what do you think is happening now? I shot back. You've been enabling him for years, and now his debts are so big that you're dragging me into it. Do you even realize how unfair that is? She looked down at her hands, her composure cracking. I just didn't know what else to do, she said softly. Your father, he promised me he'd stop. Every time, he swore it would be the last. And I wanted to believe him. Her vulnerability caught me off guard, but it didn't erase the anger simmering beneath the surface. Mom, I get that you were trying to protect us, but this isn't protection. It's denial, I said. You've been shielding him from the consequences of his actions, and now it's come back to bite all of us. I thought I was doing the right thing, she said, tears welling in her eyes. I thought if I could just fix it, we could move on. Well, you can't fix it this time, I said firmly. And I'm not going to either. If you want to help Dad, you need to do it the right way. He needs professional help, therapy, support groups, something. Throwing more money at the problem isn't going to solve anything. She nodded slowly, her tears spilling over. I just don't know if he'll go for it, she said. He's so stubborn. Then that's his choice, I said. But you can't keep sacrificing yourself, and the rest of us, for someone who won't take responsibility for his own actions. As I left her house that night, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I was still angry at her for hiding the truth, angry at my dad for putting us in this position, and angry at Julia for refusing to step up. But I also felt a twinge of sadness for my mom. She wasn't blameless, but I could see now that her actions, as misguided as they were, had come from a place of fear and desperation. She wanted to hold the family together, but in doing so, she'd allowed everything to fall apart. On the drive home, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let their mistakes consume me. My mom and dad had their own choices to make, and so did Julia. But from now on, I was going to focus on protecting myself and my future. This revelation had opened my eyes to just how deep the dysfunction ran in my family. And while I couldn't fix it, I could at least start setting boundaries. For the first time, I felt like I was finally beginning to take control. The weeks following my conversation with my mom were some of the most emotionally draining I'd ever experienced. Knowing the full extent of my dad's gambling history made it impossible to ignore just how toxic the situation had become. For years, my family had been stuck in a cycle of denial, excuses, and enabling, and I was done being a part of it. I made the difficult decision to distance myself. I stopped answering my mom's calls and ignored her increasingly desperate texts. It wasn't out of spite, but out of necessity. Every conversation with her turned into a guilt trip or an argument, and I couldn't keep allowing her words to tear me down. At first, the silence felt unbearable. For as long as I could remember, I'd been the fixer in my family, the one they turned to when things went wrong. Stepping back felt like I was abandoning my post, but I reminded myself that I wasn't responsible for holding everything together. During this time, my friends became my anchor. They didn't just offer support, they gave me perspective. You're not selfish for setting boundaries, my friend Jess told me during one of our many late-night talks. You've been carrying their baggage for years. It's about time you put it down. Claire, another close friend, chimed in. You can't fix someone who doesn't want to change, she said. And it's not your job to pay for their mistakes, literally or figuratively. Hearing their words was like a lifeline. For so long, I'd felt trapped by the expectations my family had placed on me. But my friends reminded me that I had the right to prioritize my own well-being, even if it meant disappointing people who thought they were entitled to my help. It wasn't long before my mom showed up at my apartment unannounced. When I opened the door and saw her standing there, clutching her purse and looking more frazzled than I'd ever seen her, I knew she wasn't going to let this go easily. Mom, I said, sighing, what are you doing here? I had to talk to you, she said, stepping inside before I could invite her. You've been ignoring my calls, and we can't keep pretending this isn't happening. I'm not pretending anything, I said, crossing my arms. I've told you where I stand. Her eyes filled with tears, and her voice cracked as she spoke. I don't know what to do anymore. Your father. He's drowning, and I'm drowning with him. I can't do this on my own. Her vulnerability tugged at my heart, but I forced myself to stay firm. Mom, I get that this is hard for you, I said. But throwing money at the problem isn't going to fix it. If you want to help Dad, you need to address the root of the issue, his gambling. He needs professional help, not another bailout. She shook her head, her tears spilling over. He won't go for that, she said. You know how stubborn he is? Then he has to face the consequences, I said, my tone unwavering. You can't keep sacrificing yourself, and now me, to protect him from the fallout of his own choices. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked utterly defeated. I just don't want to lose everything, she whispered. I placed a hand on her arm, softening my tone. I understand that, Mom, but you're losing yourself trying to save someone who doesn't want to be saved. And I can't be a part of that anymore. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, she nodded, wiping her tears. I'll think about what you've said, she said quietly. But I wish things were different. After she left, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. It wasn't easy standing up to her, but it felt like a turning point. not just for my relationship with my mom, but for how I approach my family as a whole. For the first time, I was prioritizing my own boundaries, even if it meant disappointing the people I loved. And while it hurt, it also felt liberating. I didn't know if my mom would follow through on getting help from my dad, or if she'd continue to enable his behavior. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let their choices dictate my life anymore. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I finally put myself first. The days following my mom's visit were eerily quiet. For someone who had been relentless in her calls and messages, her sudden silence felt unnerving. At first, I thought she might have taken my words to heart and was finally processing what I'd said. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized this wasn't reflection. It was a full-on cold shoulder. When she did eventually reach out, the warmth and familiarity that had once defined our conversations were gone. Instead, our talks were clipped, every sentence laced with tension and blame. "I hope you're happy," she said during one such call. "Your father and I are barely holding things together, and you're just standing by, watching us drown." "I'm not standing by," I replied, my voice tight. "I've given you suggestions, Mom. I've told you what I think you need to do, but I'm not going to ruin my life to fix this." Her response was sharp and cutting. "I don't know how you can call yourself part of this family when you're so willing to turn your back on us." If the strained relationship with my mom wasn't hard enough, Julia's complete indifference only made things worse. While I was grappling with the emotional fallout, she seemed utterly unaffected, as if the family drama didn't even exist. Her social media continued to be a highlight reel of extravagance. Pictures of her lounging on yachts, dining at Michelin-starred restaurants, and showing off her latest designer purchases flooded my feed. It was maddening to watch her live so lavishly while my mom painted me as the villain for refusing to shoulder the family's burden. I tried to confront her about it one last time, hoping I could at least get her to acknowledge what was happening. "Julia, do you even care about what's going on with Mom and Dad?" I asked her in a rare phone call. She sighed, sounding more annoyed than concerned. "I've already told you, this isn't my problem," she said. "Mom and Dad made their choices. If you want to let them guilt you into helping, that's your call. But don't drag me into it. Do you even realize how selfish you sound?" I shot back. "You've been living off their generosity for years, and now that they need help, you're nowhere to be found." Her voice turned cold. "I didn't ask for their help," she said, "and I'm not asking for yours. If they want to keep enabling Dad, that's on them. I'm not going to throw my money away." Her words left me speechless. As much as I hated to admit it, part of me envied her ability to detach so completely. But another part of me couldn't fathom how she could be so indifferent to the people who had done so much for her. The family dynamic felt like it had completely imploded. My mom and I were barely speaking, and when we did, it was more of a battle than a conversation. Julia had washed her hands of the situation entirely, and my dad, well, he was the eye of the storm, oblivious to the destruction his choices had caused. As much as it hurt, I knew there was nothing more I could do. I couldn't force my mom to see reason. I couldn't make Julia care, and I certainly couldn't fix my dad. Instead, I focused on protecting my own well-being. I leaned on my friends, threw myself into work, and found solace in the small joys of everyday life. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the only way forward. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about how much my life had changed in such a short time. The family I had always tried so hard to support now felt like strangers. The bonds that once held us together were frayed and fragile, and I wasn't sure if they could ever be repaired. But for the first time, I didn't feel guilty about putting myself first. I'd spent years sacrificing my own happiness to meet their expectations, and now, I was finally learning how to set boundaries. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for, but it was the one I needed. And as painful as it was, I knew I'd made the right choice. Sometimes, protecting yourself means letting go of the things that hurt you, even if those things are the people you once called family. It had been months since my mom and I had a meaningful conversation. The tension between us had cooled from a raging fire to smoldering embers, but the distance remained. I'd stopped expecting an apology, convincing myself that my mom would never truly see things from my perspective. That's why I was so surprised when she called one evening, her voice softer than I'd heard in years. "Hi, honey," she said, the usual sharpness absent. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, unsure of what to expect. "Sure," I said cautiously. She took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, about what I said, what I asked of you, and how unfair I've been." I was stunned. For a moment, I didn't even know how to respond. You think you've been unfair? I asked, my tone more incredulous than I intended. Yes, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I shouldn't have put this on your shoulders. You've always been so responsible, and I took advantage of that. I let my desperation cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry. Hearing her say those words brought a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt validated, like I'd finally been seen after years of being overlooked. But another part of me was cautious. Words were easy. Actions were harder. Thank you for saying that, I said carefully. It means a lot. But Mom, an apology doesn't fix everything. This situation didn't happen overnight, and rebuilding trust is going to take time. I know, she said quickly. And I don't expect things to go back to normal right away. But I want to try. I want to do better. For you, for all of us. As the conversation unfolded, my mom admitted things I'd suspected for years. She acknowledged the favoritism she'd shown Julia, explaining it away as a misguided attempt to protect her from life's hardships. I thought I was helping her by making things easier, she said, her voice thick with regret. But I see now that I only made things harder for you. You've had to carry so much, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. Her words were raw and genuine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like she was truly listening. But I knew this wasn't just about her understanding. It was about real change. Mom, I appreciate this, I said, but I need to see more than words. I need to know that you're serious about addressing the root of these problems. Otherwise, we're just going to end up back here again. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. I understand, she said, and I promise I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, processing everything. The apology didn't erase the years of hurt, but it felt like a step in the right direction, a small crack in the wall that had grown between us. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. But I also knew better than to place all my faith in that hope. This wasn't just about my mom's promises. It was about her actions. And while I was willing to give her the chance to make things right, I was also prepared to stand my ground if she fell back into old patterns. I wasn't sure what the future held for my family, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let myself be dragged down again. My boundaries were firm, and this time, I wasn't compromising them for anyone. The apology was a beginning, not an end. And while there was still a long road ahead, I was finally starting to believe that healing might be possible. The decision not to pay off my dad's debts was both liberating and terrifying. For so long, I'd been the default fixer in my family, the one they turned to when things spiraled out of control. Stepping back from that role felt like shedding an identity I'd worn for years, but it also came with guilt. Would they be okay without me? I reminded myself that enabling my dad wouldn't help him. It would only keep the cycle going. Instead of giving in to my mom's pleas, I encouraged her to explore professional help. He needs therapy, Mom, I told her during one of our conversations. And honestly, so do you. This isn't just about the money. It's about breaking the patterns that got us here in the first place. To my surprise, she didn't argue. She admitted she'd been looking into support groups for families dealing with gambling addiction. It was a small step, but it felt significant. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of accountability in her. As for Julia, she remained as uninvolved as ever. She didn't reach out to check on our parents or offer any support, financial or otherwise. It used to infuriate me, but now I felt more indifferent than anything. Her detachment was her choice, just as my decision to set boundaries was mine. I couldn't control how she navigated her relationship with our family, and I wasn't going to waste energy trying to change her. This year, I decided to do something completely different for the holidays. Instead of attending the usual family gatherings, I spent the day with friends who had become like a second family to me. Jess hosted a cozy dinner at her place, complete with homemade pie and mismatched chairs around a too-small table. We laughed, shared stories, and toasted to the year ahead. It wasn't extravagant, but it was warm, genuine, and full of love, the kind of environment I'd always longed for. At one point during the evening, Jess raised her glass and said, "To the family we choose." Her words hit me deeply, and I found myself holding back tears. In that moment, I realized something profound. Family isn't defined by blood or obligation. It's about the people who show up for you, who support you without strings attached, and who love you for who you are, not for what you can do for them. Looking back on everything, I understood that saying no to my mom and dad wasn't selfish. It was necessary. It wasn't easy to stand my ground, especially in a family dynamic that had always blurred the lines between love and duty. But setting boundaries was the only way to protect myself and create a healthier future. In the weeks that followed, I noticed small changes in my mom. She started attending a support group and even convinced my dad to sit in on a couple of sessions. While it was far from a perfect solution, it felt like progress. Our conversations grew less tense, and though the trust between us was still fragile, I could see she was trying. She stopped pushing me to fix things and began to focus on what she could do to help herself and my dad. As for me, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in years. Without the weight of their expectations on my shoulders, I could finally focus on my own life, my own goals, and my own happiness. The journey wasn't without its challenges, but it taught me one of the most important lessons of my life. Love doesn't mean losing yourself for others. It means showing up in a way that honors both your needs and theirs. And sometimes that means saying no. For the first time, I felt like I was living life on my terms. And that was more than enough.